Picture this. A man thinks he understands himself. He's navigated the world, built a career, formed opinions, created an identity. He believes he knows what drives him, what he wants, who he is. Then he enters into deep intimacy with one woman. Not just physical, but psychological, emotional, sustained intimacy. And suddenly, everything he thought he knew begins to unravel and rebuild itself from the ground up. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who founded analytical psychology, observed something that most people overlook. Sex with one woman over time doesn't just satisfy a biological urge. It initiates a complete psychological transformation that rewires how a man relates to himself, to the feminine, and to reality itself. This isn't about romance or relationship advice. This is about the architecture of the male psyche and what happens when it encounters something it cannot control, cannot fully understand, and cannot escape from once the process begins. Jung spent decades studying the human unconscious, working with patients, analyzing dreams, exploring mythology and religion across cultures. What he discovered was that men carry within them an unconscious feminine component he called the Anima, a hidden dimension of themselves that remains undeveloped, projected outward onto women, and largely inaccessible until a specific kind of relationship forces it into consciousness. And the vehicle for this forced encounter: sustained sexual and emotional intimacy with one woman. Most men move through life with their anima completely unconscious. They project this inner feminine onto every woman they encounter, seeing not actual women but their own unconscious material reflected back at them. They fall in love with projections, chase fantasies, and never actually meet the real human being in front of them. But when a man commits to one woman, when he returns again and again to the same person, when he cannot escape into new projections, when he must face the reality of who she actually is beyond his fantasies, something remarkable and terrifying happens. The projection begins to fail. And when the projection fails, the real psychological work begins. This is why Jung argued that casual sexual encounters, while they may satisfy immediate desires, never initiate this deeper transformation. The man simply moves from projection to projection, from fantasy to fantasy, never staying long enough for reality to shatter his illusions. He remains psychologically frozen, relating to women as objects of his unconscious rather than as separate, complex human beings. But sustained intimacy? That's different. That's where the psyche has no escape route. That's where transformation becomes inevitable. The rewiring Jung observed isn't metaphorical. When a man engages sexually and emotionally with one woman over months and years, several psychological processes converge. His projections collapse. His anima begins to integrate. His relationship to the feminine shifts from external to internal, and his entire emotional and psychological landscape reorganizes itself around this new internal relationship. The woman he's with serves as a catalyst, but the real transformation happens inside him, in how he relates to his own inner feminine, his emotions, his capacity for connection, his understanding of himself. What makes this process so powerful is that sex is not just physical. In Jung's framework, sexual union represents the ultimate collision between conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, known and unknown. Every sexual encounter with the same woman is an encounter with his own anima, his own unconscious material, his own hidden depths. Over time, this repeated encounter forces integration. The unconscious becomes conscious. The projected becomes internal. The external woman reveals the internal feminine he's been carrying all along. This is not comfortable. This is not easy. Most men resist this process with everything they have because it threatens the ego's sense of control and identity. But for those who allow it, who stay present through the discomfort, who don't run back to the safety of new projections and new fantasies, the result is a fundamental reorganization of the masculine psyche that Jung considered essential for psychological wholeness. So let's break down exactly how this process works, what Jung observed in his clinical practice and theoretical work, and why this understanding changes everything about how we think about male psychology, intimacy, and transformation. To understand why sex with one woman rewires men, we first need to understand Jung's concept of the anima, arguably one of his most important and most misunderstood contributions to psychology. Jung observed that every man carries within his unconscious a feminine component, just as every woman carries a masculine component, which he called the animus. This isn't about gender roles or societal conditioning. This is about archetypal structures in the psyche itself. The anima represents everything in the male psyche that has been repressed, rejected, or left undeveloped because it doesn't fit masculine identification. Emotions, intuition, receptivity, connection, the irrational, the mysterious, all of this gets pushed into the unconscious and forms the anima. But here's what's crucial. The anima doesn't disappear just because it's unconscious. Instead, it becomes immensely powerful precisely because it's hidden. An unconscious anima operates autonomously, influencing a man's moods, his attractions, his obsessions, his depressions, his creative impulses, and especially his relationships with women. All without his awareness or consent. The unconscious anima is like a second personality operating behind the scenes, making decisions the conscious ego doesn't understand. When the anima remains unconscious, it gets projected onto external women. This is why men fall in love at first sight, become obsessed with women they barely know, idealize feminine figures, or swing between worship and contempt for the same woman. They're not actually relating to real women. They're relating to their own unconscious feminine projected outward. The woman becomes a screen onto which the man projects his anima, and he responds to his own projection rather than to her actual humanity. Jung identified several developmental stages of the anima, from the most primitive, Eve, representing pure biological instinct, to the most developed, Sophia, representing wisdom and spiritual connection. Most men, he observed, remain stuck in the early stages, relating to women primarily through instinct, romantic fantasy, or maternal dependence. The anima remains infantile because it never faces reality long enough to mature. The masculine ego, in Jung's framework, is characterized by consciousness, differentiation, analysis, control, and achievement. It's oriented toward the external world, toward mastery and understanding. But this comes at a cost. The masculine ego becomes cut off from its own depths, from the unconscious realm where emotions, dreams, intuitions, and the irrational hold sway. The anima is the bridge between these two worlds, between ego and unconscious, between masculine consciousness and the depths of the psyche. When a man has no relationship with his anima, he has no access to his own emotional life, his own interior world, his own depths. He becomes rigid, cut off, defended, unable to truly connect with himself or others. He may achieve external success, but he remains internally impoverished. Jung saw this condition everywhere in modern men, accomplished on the outside, empty on the inside, disconnected from anything that gives life real meaning. So the anima serves two functions. It's both the problem and the solution. As long as it remains unconscious and projected, it creates chaos, obsession, mood swings, and impossible relationships. But when it begins to integrate, when it becomes conscious and related to, it becomes the man's access point to his own depths, his guide to the unconscious, his connection to meaning, soul, and genuine intimacy. And this is where sex with one woman becomes psychologically critical. Because the anima can only be withdrawn from projection and integrated through sustained reality-based relationship with an actual woman who refuses to remain a fantasy object. The woman who stays, who reveals herself as human rather than ideal, who doesn't fit the projection but insists on being seen as she actually is. This woman forces the man's anima out of hiding. Sexual intimacy accelerates this process exponentially because sex is where the projection is strongest and where reality intrudes most powerfully. A man can maintain fantasies about a woman he sees occasionally, but he cannot maintain them through sustained sexual and emotional intimacy. The body knows. The unconscious knows. The projection begins to crack. This cracking of the projection, this is where the rewiring begins. Because once the man can no longer project his anima onto the woman in front of him, he's forced to deal with it directly. He's forced to encounter his own feminine within himself. And that encounter changes everything. Let's talk about what actually happens in the beginning. When a man first encounters the woman who will eventually rewire him. Because Jung understood that this process begins with projection. Powerful, overwhelming, seemingly magical projection that the man experiences as falling in love, but which is actually his first encounter with his own unconscious anima. The man sees a woman and something ignites. He doesn't know why. He can't explain it rationally. She possesses some quality, a way of moving, a look in her eyes, a tone of voice, an energy that captures him completely. Jung would say this woman has constellation, his anima, Something about her resonates with his unconscious feminine structure, and he projects the entire contents of his anima onto her. Suddenly she becomes the most fascinating, beautiful, perfect woman he's ever encountered. This is not about her objective qualities. Another man might walk past her without a second glance. This is about resonance between her actual characteristics and his unconscious anima structure. She fits the pattern. She activates the archetype. And the man, completely unconsciously, falls into a psychological process that's far older and deeper than his individual consciousness. What he doesn't realize, what he cannot realize in this phase, is that everything he's attracted to in her is actually a reflection of his own unconscious material. Her mystery? That's his own unexplored depths. Her emotional fluidity? That's his own repressed feeling function. Her intuition? That's his own rejected irrational knowing. He's not falling in love with her. He's falling into relationship with his own anima, but experiencing it as external because the anima is still completely unconscious. Jung observed that men in this projection phase become almost possessed. They lose their usual rational control. They make decisions that seem completely out of character. They reorganize their entire lives around access to this woman. Their friends don't understand it. They don't understand it themselves. But the psyche knows what it's doing. It's creating the conditions for transformation by binding the man to the catalyst through the most powerful force available. Erotic fascination combined with unconscious projection. The sexual dimension is critical here. Sexual desire in Jungian terms is never just physical. It's the psyche's desire for union with its own unconscious contents, symbolized and mediated through union with another person. When a man desires a woman on whom he's projected his anima, he's actually desiring integration with his own feminine, his own depths, his own soul. But he experiences this as desire for her body, her presence, her being. So the early sexual encounters are charged with this projection. Every time he touches her, he's symbolically touching his own anima. Every time he enters her, he's symbolically entering his own unconscious. The intensity, the obsession, the feeling that this is somehow cosmically significant, all of this makes sense when you understand what's actually happening psychologically. This isn't just two people having sex. This is the masculine ego encountering its own unconscious feminine through the medium of sexual union. But here's what makes this process transformative, rather than just another obsession. Sustained intimacy over time begins to erode the projection. In casual encounters or brief relationships, the man never stays long enough for reality to intrude. He can maintain the fantasy, extract what he needs psychologically from the projection, and move on before the illusion shatters. His anima remains safely projected, his psyche remains unchanged, and he's free to repeat the pattern with the next woman. But with one woman, over time, through repeated sexual and emotional intimacy, something different happens. The woman begins to emerge from behind the projection. She has bad days, she has needs, she disagrees with him. She fails to match the fantasy in countless small ways. Her reality, her actual humanity, begins to assert itself against his projection. And this is uncomfortable, confusing, sometimes enraging for the man because his psyche is trying to maintain the projection while reality keeps destroying it. Jung called this the crisis point in relationship. Many men flee at this stage, seeking a new woman onto whom they can project the undisturbed anima once more. But if the man stays, if he continues sexual and emotional intimacy with the same woman even as the projection begins to fail, then the real transformation can begin. Because once he can no longer project his anima onto her, he has no choice but to deal with it directly within himself. The woman he's having sex with is no longer a screen for his fantasies. She's a real person, and that means his anima has nowhere to hide. It must come home. It must integrate. And that integration is what rewires everything. Now we arrive at the heart of Jung's insight, how sustained sexual and emotional intimacy with one woman forces the integration of the anima, and why this integration fundamentally rewires the male psyche. When the projection begins to fail, when the man can no longer sustain his fantasy of the woman because her reality keeps intruding, he enters what Jung considered the most psychologically productive and most painful phase of relationship. The woman is no longer perfect. She's human. She has flaws, needs, boundaries, her own interior life that has nothing to do with him. and this failure of projection creates a crisis in the man's psyche. His first impulse is usually rage, disappointment, or withdrawal. The woman changed. She's not who I thought she was. She disappointed me. But Jung understood that these reactions are actually the ego's resistance to the real work that needs to happen. The withdrawal of projection and the integration of the anima back into the man's own psyche, where it belongs. This is where sustained sexual intimacy becomes the crucible for transformation. Because even as the romantic projection fails, the sexual connection continues. The man keeps returning to the same woman, keeps entering into physical and emotional vulnerability with her, keeps experiencing moments of union and dissolution of ego boundaries. Sex becomes the container that holds the transformation process in place, even when the ego wants to flee. Every sexual encounter at this stage is doing multiple things simultaneously. Physically, it's creating bonding through oxytocin, vasopressin, and other neurochemicals that attach the man to this specific woman. But psychologically, and this is what Jung emphasized, it's forcing the man to encounter his own anima in increasingly conscious ways. He can no longer sustain the fantasy that she's his perfect anima figure. So the anima begins to separate from her and become visible as an aspect of himself. This is profoundly disorienting. The man begins to experience emotions he couldn't access before. Feelings arise that seem to come from nowhere. He becomes moody, reactive, uncertain in ways that feel foreign to his usual masculine self-image. Jung would say, this is the anima becoming conscious. All that repressed feminine material is surfacing, and the ego doesn't know what to do with it. The woman, meanwhile, is no longer serving as a container for his projections. She's just herself living her own life, making her own choices. And this forces the man to develop a new kind of relationship, not to his fantasy of her, but to her actual being. He must learn to see her as a separate person, to respect her boundaries, to encounter her reality rather than his projection. This is the death of the infantile anima and the birth of a mature relationship to the feminine. But here's what makes sex specifically so powerful in this process. Sexual union creates a temporary dissolution of ego boundaries. In orgasm, the man experiences ego death, a moment of merging and loss of self. This repeated experience of dissolution trains the masculine ego to release its rigid control, to surrender, to trust in processes it cannot dominate. Over time, this capacity for surrender in sex begins to generalize into surrender to the transformation process itself. Jung observed that men who allow this process report profound changes, increased emotional availability, deeper capacity for empathy, access to intuition and creativity that was previously blocked, ability to form genuine intimacy rather than just projection-based connections, and a sense of inner wholeness that doesn't depend on external achievement. These aren't vague benefits. This is structural rewiring of how the psyche functions. The anima, once integrated even partially, becomes an internal guide rather than an external obsession. The man develops relationship with his own feminine, his own feeling function, his own depths. He can access emotions without being overwhelmed by them. He can be intuitive without abandoning rationality. He can be receptive without losing his capacity for assertion. The rigid masculine ego softens and becomes more flexible, more human, more whole. And all of this happens through the vehicle of sustained sexual and emotional intimacy with one woman who refused to remain a fantasy object and insisted on being human instead. If you're finding this valuable, drop a comment below sharing your own observations about how sustained intimacy changes people. Have you witnessed this transformation in yourself or others? I read every comment and I'm genuinely curious about your experiences with these patterns. The question now becomes, what does this transformation actually look like in practice? And how does it manifest in a man's life in psychology? Let's get concrete about what Jung observed happens to a man's psyche when the anima integration process unfolds through sustained intimacy with one woman. This isn't abstract theory. This is observable, reproducible transformation that Jung documented across decades of clinical work. First, there's a fundamental shift in how the man experiences emotions. Before anima integration, most men relate to emotions as intrusions, weaknesses, or problems to be solved. Emotions happen to them, overwhelming the rational ego, and the typical masculine response is suppression, denial, or explosive discharge. But as the anima integrates, emotions become experienced differently, as information, as depth, as connection to something meaningful rather than as threats to ego control. The man discovers he can feel sadness without collapsing, anger without violence, fear without paralysis, joy without euphoria. The emotional life becomes nuanced, differentiated, available as a resource rather than experienced as an enemy. Jung attributed this directly to the integration of the feminine function through relationship. The woman doesn't teach him to feel. She catalyzes the integration of his own feminine capacity for feeling that was always there but remained unconscious and projected. Second, the man's relationship to the irrational changes completely. Most men orient themselves toward logic, control, planning, understanding. The irrational, dreams, intuitions, synchronicities, the numinous, gets dismissed or ignored. But the integrated anima serves as a bridge to the unconscious, and suddenly the man has access to knowing that doesn't come through rational analysis. He develops what Jung called intuitive intelligence, the ability to sense patterns, read situations, know things without knowing how he knows them. This isn't about becoming less rational. It's about the rational ego gaining access to the irrational psyche and learning to work with both. The man becomes more whole, operating from both conscious understanding and unconscious wisdom, rather than being trapped in one-sided rationality that cuts him off from half of reality. Third, creativity and meaning-making undergo radical transformation. Jung observed that men whose animas remain unconscious and projected tend to be cut off from genuine creativity and meaning. They might be successful, productive, accomplished, but there's a sterility to it, a sense that they're going through motions without touching anything real. The integrated anima changes this completely because the anima is the soul-making function, the part of the psyche that creates meaning, generates symbols, connects to what matters. Men report that after this integration process, work that once seemed important now feels hollow, while pursuits they'd dismissed as impractical suddenly feel essential. The anima reorients the entire value system toward what Jung called psychic reality, the internal world of meaning, connection, depth, and soul, rather than purely external achievement. This doesn't make men less effective in the world, it makes them effective in service of something real rather than in service of ego inflation. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the man's capacity for genuine intimacy transforms. Before integration, men typically relate to women through projection, need, or transaction. The woman exists to fulfill the man's unconscious demands, to mirror his anima, to mother him, to validate him, to complete him. This isn't relationship, it's unconscious dependence masquerading as love. But when the anima integrates, the man no longer needs the woman to carry his unconscious material. He has access to his own feminine, his own depths, his own capacity for connection. This means he can finally see the actual woman in front of him, rather than his projection. He can love her for who she is, rather than for who he needs her to be. This is the shift from projection-based romance to genuine intimacy, from unconscious entanglement to conscious relationship between two whole people. Jung was clear that this transformation is never complete. The anima is an archetype, and archetypes can be related to but never fully integrated or exhausted. There's always more depth, more unconscious material, more shadow feminine that remains hidden. But even partial integration creates fundamental rewiring because it shifts the man from unconscious relationship to the feminine, all projection, no awareness, to conscious relationship. Ongoing dialogue between ego and anima, mediated initially through the actual woman, and eventually internalized. The woman who catalyzes this transformation isn't doing anything special. She's simply being human, being herself, refusing to remain a fantasy object. But by staying present, by continuing sexual and emotional intimacy even as projections fail, she creates the conditions for the man's anima to come home. She's the catalyst. But the transformation happens within him. And this is why sex with one woman rewires men in ways that casual encounters never can. The moment reality intrudes, you can swipe to the next projection carrier. The masculine psyche remains frozen in an adolescent pattern of projection and pursuit, never maturing into conscious relationship with its own feminine. But here's what's remarkable. The human psyche still wants this transformation. Men report feeling empty, disconnected, hollow, despite access to more sexual variety than any previous generation. The freedom to avoid the rewiring process doesn't eliminate the need for it. If anything, it makes the need more acute, because men are now aging without ever undergoing the fundamental psychological maturation that sustained intimacy provides. For women understanding this process, the implications are equally profound. You're not responsible for a man's anima integration. That's his work and his alone. But understanding that initial intense attraction is often projection, rather than genuine seeing, can help you navigate early relationship stages with more clarity. And recognizing that the discomfort when projections fail is actually the beginning of real relationship, rather than the end, can help you distinguish men who are capable of transformation from men who will simply flee to the next projection. The path forward, in Jung's framework, is conscious relationship, with yourself first, then with others. For men, this means doing the internal work of anima integration, which might be initiated through relationship with one woman but must ultimately become an internal process. Therapy, dream work, creative expression, meditation, these are all ways to develop conscious relationship with your own feminine, without remaining dependent on external women to carry it for you. For both men and women, this means understanding that intensity isn't depth, projection isn't love, and the failure of fantasy isn't the failure of relationship. It's the beginning of real connection. It means choosing consciousness over comfort, transformation over transaction, and depth over distraction. Jung believed that this work of anima integration was essential not just for individual men, but for culture itself. A world full of men with unconscious, projected animas is a world full of men who can't access their own depths, can't form genuine intimacy, can't relate to the feminine except as object or fantasy. This creates suffering for everyone. For the men trapped in one-sided consciousness, for the women burdened with male projections, and for the culture that loses access to the depth, meaning, and soul that integrated masculinity provides. The rewiring that happens through sustained intimacy with one woman is ultimately the rewiring of consciousness itself, from fragmented to whole, from unconscious to aware, from projected to integrated. This is the work. This is the transformation. This is why it matters. If this video resonated with you, I need you to do two things. First, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're going deep into Jung's insights on relationship, shadow work, and psychological transformation in upcoming videos. Second, share this with one person who needs to hear it. Someone navigating intimacy. Someone confused about why their patterns keep repeating. Someone ready to understand what's actually happening beneath the surface of attraction and relationship. Drop a comment telling me what clicked for you, what you're wrestling with, or what you want to explore next. This work matters, and I'm grateful you're here for it.